but yet it was not predictable. And as you think about what you do at work every day, just keep that concept in mind. Most of us are narrowly framed in what we expect, right? The routine of day-to-day existence. It is really scary to be inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C. right now. The conversations about funding for environmental health programs and public health programs, it is warfare there. And with the budget climate the way it is, it's really frightening. I'm not encouraging you to vote one way or the other, but I am encouraging you and your friends to vote in the next presidential election. I think it was Mitt Romney who said this is the most important presidential election in your lifetime. I'm not sure I agree, but I think it's an important one. And so we don't know how a new, whether or a continuation of the current administration, what they will do in the next 4 years. This will have potentially dramatic effect on this country and its health status. So this is an example of inductive reasoning. Now then, if Marilyn, I don't know if you want to run with a class exercise here. Choose an example of deductive reasoning used in Coupa work and list the premises which lead to the conclusion.
Okay. You can, if you'd like to, you can kind of, this is a talky thing, okay? So you feel free to talk amongst each other to do this thing. But what we want to do is we want to get a deductive and an inductive one. We're going to do the same thing with each, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to choose an example of deductive reasoning. And if you want to remember back, deductive was the one for the example that was the height one, okay? So the deductive was the one that said, I can know that this height and this height and this means that we've got, that's the one that you've got the actual logical conclusion that you can follow. Inductive is the evidence one, the swan example, okay? So inductive is the swan one, deductive was the height one, okay? If you have trouble remembering which is which. The first, so what we're going to do is we're going to say we want a Coupa work example for each of those, and we need to come up with the premises that, because those are the pieces that we come to these conclusions. So we've got to come up with the conclusions, and we got to come up with the premises. So first thing we need to do is come up with what we're going to talk about in Coupa work, okay? So who's got an example we can work on? This is our work. What is something you reason through?
I think you could do an inductive one where you take like a specific industry, automotive repair. Every time I do an automotive repair inspection, I issue a notice of violation. You know, like you can infer that every time. You know, every
Okay. So I inspect. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Okay. So automotive repair shops. I went to an automotive repair shop. I've gone to in my, I don't want to say how many inspections I might have gone to that were automotive repair, but an inspector has gone to 200 automotive repair inspections. Every automotive repair inspection they've ever gone to, not one of those has had the waste oil drum labeled. Does that meet anybody's, by the way, experience? Okay, so used oil is not labeled. Therefore, no one in the automotive industry labels their drums. Now, which form of reasoning was that I just gave you? Inductive, right? Because the conclusion was just based on it was a pour. So the premises were, I've gone to so many of them. I'm an inspector who inspects automotive industries. I've gone to a large number of them. Every one I went to, the drums weren't labeled, therefore nobody does that, right? And that was very much also an example of overstating a conclusion. So that was an example of inductive. Now let's try for a deductive one. So we might as well stay in automotive because that's something we're all familiar with. Who wants to give an example of something we can do that's deductive? What can we absolutely say? You guys have to do it when you write enforcement reports. Let me give you that hint. In enforcement reports, you're probably more keyed on what you can really conclude. Yes, you had an example.
car maintenance shop changes oil. If you change oil, you generate used oil. If you generate used oil, you're a hazardous waste generator.
Okay, so let's break that down into the regulatory. Title 22 lists used oil as a hazardous waste. California lists used oil as a hazardous waste. Or let's see, non-record hazardous waste, whatever, however you want to do it. So if you want to say, well, I'm going to go, the facility is saying they don't generate hazardous waste. The facility generates used oil. California lists used oil as a hazardous waste. Therefore, the facility generates a hazardous waste. Would that be deductive reasoning? What do you think, Dr. Dean? Did we do it?
I think we're good.
Or can you?
Well, I would just keep in mind that as individuals you work with and regulate, if they're using inductive reasoning, you need to be sure that they recognize that they're not stating facts. They are stating premises that in totality they're hoping you will reach the same conclusion that they have reached. And the ability to differentiate between deductive and inductive, I think is actually a useful tool. Sir?
What you're looking at on inductive is like qualitative sampling. So it's pretty much qualitative what you just said, like 200 samples.
Can you pass that down,
So
please?
the sample area that you're looking at is not so much conducive to what you're seeing globally, but you're just looking at what you've done. But others might have seen the total opposite. So your case and the other person's case might differ based upon the fact of the ones that you review versus the ones they reviewed. So in the reasoning aspect, we got to make sure that when you do a sample, you got to have a relative sample of both sides. So therefore, it can one day be deductive. So therefore, you can say, well, half of the vendors that we service in this area are doing the right thing, and the other half we need to work towards making sure they get it done.
And I need to be careful to make sure that I'm not.
Marilyn, there's a comment.
Yes, last week I had an enforcement settlement negotiation for an electroplating company. And this kind of the deductive inductive really came across because as we were going through the violations, I was using the deductive reasonings of, you violated this, this is our evidence, therefore you're going to get a penalty. And on the other side of the argument was, well, I hadn't really taken over the facility. I was just an employee. I really wasn't the manager. They kind of tried to bring a lot of different reasoning why it really wasn't a violation. So I could see the differences, and that's good to know about what kind of. In fact, that's what I was trying to do before our session, is to kind of go through and think about what kind of comebacks he would have for these violations, but some of them surprised me.
Thank you. And I should be clear that it's not necessarily to say that I made it one of those a negative example, in the inductive one. That's not to say that there's anything wrong with an inductive argument. That may be, it's a lot of what we have to deal with is the preponderance of what we can see. And it might not be something where you can deduce what it is. But as the gentleman said, we need to be recognizing that it's inductive, and when we're being deductive. And I know that in my experience, we do tend to get much more deductive when we're in our enforcement brain and we're saying, I can make my case on a deductive basis, and we have other experiences where we're being more inductive in our, here's all of what, this is what we saw, but then we have to recognize the limitations of what we saw in these circumstances and what we didn't see. So, thank you.
Which leads us, and thank you, ma'am, for your comment, which leads us to our next slide. Thank you. We didn't pay her to say this, by the way, but this issue of an explanation. And as a professor in graduate school, I would often get explanations as to why people didn't submit their assignments and why they were tardy with certain obligations. An explanation, for purposes of today's dialogue, is a claim or set of claims intended to make a claim, object, or event or a state of affairs intelligible. That is, so why did this happen? Right? It's the contextual part of it. That's different than an argument, which is intended to support, right? An argument, you've got all these premises. An explanation is slightly different. And I know you guys hear explanations every day, don't you? Right? Folks are out there explaining why this happened, and they just took over the new company, and they have all these things, and you know, those aren't facts, right? Those aren't premises. Those are intended to help frame out what it is that they're trying to convey to you. There are two types of causal explanations I want you to be aware of, right? The first type are what would be referred to as physical explanations, and this is the domain of your world, you guys in this room. These include the natural sciences, such as atmospheric conditions, relative humidity, temperature, lower explosive limit meter readings, pH, geological conditions. I just put together a list of things that I thought would resonate with you. So there's the first type of causal explanation. And I don't know if you want to talk about these. Mary.
Yeah, and just I wanted to make a note about those physical explanation cautions for us. Remember that in our world, sometimes even those physical explanations are based on some assumptions. And so we even have to check our assumptions on the physical explanations, meaning that what are you really measuring and observing, and what assumptions are you making based on the measurement equipment that you're using? So things like, did you measure only what you were looking for and what else might be there? So the fact is that you discovered something doesn't mean that it's the item that is the problem. That means you might have discovered something. And this is kind of like the looking for the data that isn't there, you know, or looking only at the data that isn't there. So they're similar issues, but in the physical world you can have the same problem. And are your conclusions consistent with what you were and were not measuring? So for those who may be emergency response oriented, why do we measure O2 before we measure LEL? Anybody? Well, oxygen deficient atmospheres, and what about the LEL equipment?
It needs oxygen.
Right, you can't, your LEL equipment can't work if the oxygen isn't in the expected ranges, right? So one of the assumptions that's made in our world has to do with when we're using our equipment that there are certain ranges we're in. So even in our world, since we sometimes are working in extreme conditions or we're looking for contaminants or whatever that might be, is that we even have some places here where we need to be very specific about the assumptions that we're having. So same thing like in what type of solutions will pH paper not measure a result? What type of solution, or answer the other, what type of solutions is pH paper meant for? Say it again.
Aqueous.
Aqueous. What does that really mean? So water-based, not solvent-based, right? So when we're measuring, we got to make sure there's some water in there. So can you put pH paper in a liquid and not get a valid conclusion?
Of course.
Absolutely, right? So it's really important to know not what your data, what data your conclusion is based on and what is at risk, because how much you're going to drill down into whether you have what your assumptions are and how much you have to look at this is partly going to be based on how risky is this move I'm going to make. So we have these rules about things like checking at least 3 resources or whatever it is, depending on how risky the action you're about to take is. You know, are you sending people in? Or what are you doing out there? But I just wanted to make sure that when we're talking about physical in the hazmat world, even there, we have to be really cautious about assumptions that we have, and they are not always the same assumptions as colleagues we're working with. So fire safety, the people, and that's partly why we work in teams, right? Life safety, environmental health, and we work together. We sometimes work as a team, unified command if it's emergency response, or if it's site remediation, we work with geologists and toxicologists and labs, because we all bring pieces of that picture together, because this is a complex environment all by itself. So just a reminder that our work of assumptions also goes way down, even into the physical side. Thanks, Dr.
Thanks. Any questions? Okay, now the ones that are probably more amusing than the physical ones are the behavioral explanations. And any of us in the room that are parents, I know, have heard some very amusing behavioral explanations for some of the things your children have tried to communicate to you. So this tries to elucidate the causes of behavior, acts of buffoonery, if you will, and takes into account history, psychology, political science, sociology, and probably some of the other behavioral sciences as well. And which leads us to technical versus adaptive kinds of challenges related to this.
And this is a model, and I apologize for how much is on here. This is mostly to remind me about how to talk, what to talk about here. It's actually a model that I learned in my faith-based experiences with the difference between technical behavior and technical issues and adaptive issues. We're pretty comfortable because of our backgrounds of dealing with technical issues. In fact, that's probably our forte. Give me a technical problem, please. An adaptive problem is a little bit harder for us. And the difference is that technical problems have at least one known solution. The solution exists out there. That's a technical problem. It doesn't mean technical in the way we use the term sometimes, that meaning that it has to do with something physical or it has something to do with something that requires you to have technical training. It means there at least is one solution that exists to it. And that some expert somewhere, even if you have to go out and find them, actually knows what to do. Somebody knows what to do. So at least one solution exists. Somebody out there somewhere knows what to do. And so for us, that might be things like it's addressed in regulation, operating procedures, guidance, training, things like that. So for us, that's what we're talking about. Technical challenge, at least someone knows what to do. It's been addressed, okay? So that's the world we live in when we say, you know, you got to install an underground tank in accordance with guidelines. That is a technical challenge. And basically, people that are in Coupa world are pretty comfortable saying, I know what to do when you say, I've got to put in an underground storage tank in accordance with the normal guidelines, okay? Now, things like determine if a substance meets a regulatory definition of hazardous waste. Is it easy? That is not the difference between technical and adaptive, easy or hard. It just means that there are guidelines on how it should be done, and there are resources that can be applied to it. Things like in our SIRS world, that we're going to have to correct the local database support code tables to match the SIRS 2 data dictionary requirements. Ugly, yes, but technical. That is, there'll be a known requirement for that field length to be like this, and we can make the solution happen. Now, let's talk about adaptive, because it's adaptive that usually is the place that trips us up and challenges us more. One, the problem has never been defined. Two, the issue is new, never seen before. And these can be either ors. Any one of these can make it adaptive. Either the problem has never been defined, or the issue is new, never seen before. No one knows exactly what to do. And it requires a team effort. So, some of our examples right now, compliance where an owner is without motivation or resources. It's not really, how many times do you run into a technical problem where the guy can't comply? Is that really your main problem? That the guy can't comply? What's your real problem? Your real problem is that the guy won't comply. Not that he can't comply, it's a behavioral issue. And that's where adaptive is actually on the behavioral side. And the reason why the problem has never been resolved. Behavioral issues are adaptive issues. They're not technical issues. We've never resolved the issues of non-compliant operators. We've never resolved them because they're that person's issue, having to do with their framing, actually. Second one, computer or English language proficiency or access for regulatory compliance issues. The SIRS issue of people who have no computers. That issue is one, it's not really that it hasn't been defined, we know about it, but the issue really hasn't been seen before in this context. That is, we're trying to get people to comply with something and we're really not sure what to do. But no one really knows what to do about this. Okay, we're going to go, and it certainly has never been resolved. We're trying to address something that's an equity issue, a business equity issue. We've got a law that says you have to automate, you have to have an email address, and we've got a business population that may not use computers in their regular line of business. That's an adaptive challenge. That's not a technical thing where you can go in and apply a known solution to a known problem and just say, fix it. You're going to have a much more creative process to get there, and it'll have to be a team process. That's the definition of what adaptive is. And the last one is that all the new business processes that you're going to have as a unified program agency for electronic reporting. That meaning that everything in your office that will end up changing because now things are coming in the door electronically instead of on paper. That would be something that is, the issue is new. The issue is new. There aren't rules about how to do this. You're making it up. And we're all making it up, okay? Those are adaptive problems. One of the reasons for recognizing the difference between a technical problem and an adaptive problem is that when you try to apply a technical solution to an adaptive problem, you're asking for frustration. Because we go in there with technical solutions and say, I'll write a guidance document. I'll tell you that'll fix the problem. Or I'm going to write, they're out of compliance. That's the problem. I'm going to issue an NOV. They're out of compliance. Well, when we're dealing with adaptive problems, you're going to have to get in there and deal with with an adaptive issue. You're trying to change someone's behavior. You have to deal with their frame, with their assumptions, with their learning, with their motivation, and with ours, as far as being Coupas doing electronic reporting, you're talking about making behavioral changes. And trying to make behavioral changes is very different than applying technical solutions. And we're mostly dealing with people who are very comfortable in making technical changes, technical solutions. Most of our people have been trained to do technical work, not behave. They're very good at, I have great respect for our fleet of inspectors as far as doing the education work. So they do know how to do behavioral modification to a certain degree. They go out and train the businesses and they kind of teach them how to comply. But we have to recognize when what they're doing is adaptive work and not technical work. Any questions on that? Okay. We have one more slide on this that's an example.
If I could just give a quick example of a deductive argument and a behavioral explanation. About 15 years ago, we were retained by the Secret Service to assess headaches of its staff working in the evening in Washington, D.C. These were the swing shift staff that came in at 4 in the afternoon and worked till midnight. And these are the people that you never see. They're in the basement of a building a couple blocks from the White House who have cameras all over buildings in Washington. This is before 9/11. And their job is to simply watch what's going on in D.C. But so they're in the basement of a building. This building was 7 or 8 stories, and below them was a parking garage. And each evening at 7, 8 in the evening, the staff there started to report headaches. And we used some deductive logic to, well, what causes headaches in staff other than stressful working conditions and unreasonable bosses? Any guesses? Carbon monoxide. And what we had learned is that as employees over time were moving to 4 10-hour days in Washington, D.C., they were staying later into the evening. And what happened was, to save energy, the building owner would turn the fans off in the parking garage at like 6:30. And so any cars that were turned on and then or engaged and then drove out were releasing combustion products to the parking garage. And what does hot air do?
Wow.
It rises and it rose right into the first floor of the building, or in that case it was referred to as the basement. And so carbon monoxide, and we were able then to detect CO with our meters that rose from 2 parts per million to 5 to 7 to 12. I mean, it was pretty interesting to see the progression throughout the evening. And so what was the explanation? The explanation was the building management, right? We used deductive logic to figure out that had occurred. And that's actually a true story. And so hopefully that provides you yet another illustration of what some of this looks like. In Maryland?
Okay, now, we'll see if this helps or doesn't help or whatever, but this is to try to say, when you have the difference between a technical and adaptive problem, what does that mean in terms of how you address it, okay? So when you have a clear problem definition and a clear solution, technical work, you can assign that work to individuals and contractors. So that you have an underground storage tank that needs to be plan checked, you're going to assign it to a plan checker to do, or a contractor or something like that for contract work. And the time and cost is generally predictable by the work and volume, because this is the kind of work that can be predicted. When you have a problem, and I'm going to skip down to the bottom one because the middle is kind of a hybrid, the bottom one where you have a problem that requires learning, and you have a solution that requires learning, and which we've defined, that kind of work is called adaptive work. You're going to need to assign that to a multidisciplinary team, and you're going to need leadership on that team. You're going to need to assign some real leadership to help guide that team. So the time and cost is much longer and uncertain as to what's going to work out of that. And then you've got the kind of situation that's in the middle of that, where you might even have a clear problem definition. You know what your problem is, but you don't have the solution figured out yet. The solution requires some learning. And that is going to be a combination of some technical work and adaptive work. And I think SIRS is putting us a lot into this middle ground here. And for that, then you are going to need a qualified team, and you can expect that your costs are going to be a combination of some of this predictable stuff and some of this long and uncertain stuff, and it's going to be in the middle there. But you need to make sure you understand what type of work is what. And when people are starting to sit here and go, why is this project running over here and there? You might actually want to make sure that you've assigned technical people, technical work, and you haven't. And we've made some of these mistakes in this last year that we're learning from, where we may have assigned to adaptive work without adequate leadership and described it as technical work and not really realized what we were doing. And this is related to SIRS kind of stuff that we've done. And that's because we really hadn't defined how much of this was a change, a brand new stuff that we're talking about doing. And it really wasn't as technical as you might think. It really was asking people to go into brand new territory and think of new ways of doing things. And for that, you need not only the multidisciplinary team, but you need to assign leadership to that, to take care of it. Okay.
So here are some things as we talk about explanations and the why question. Do you recall just why